How fasting can reverse type 2 diabetes? Is it really possible? More than 500 million people worldwide are living with type 2 diabetes. And most of them have been told the same thing. This is a lifelong condition. You can manage it, but you can't reverse it. But what if high blood sugar isn't the true root of the problem? What if the real issue is energy overload inside your liver and pancreas, and your body already has a built-in mechanism to repair itself when given the right conditions? In today's video, we're breaking down the biology behind the big question: how fasting can reverse type 2 diabetes. This isn't hype. It's not a miracle claim. It's the science of insulin resistance, fatty liver, pancreatic stress, and how intermittent fasting may help unload an overfilled energy storage system. If you've ever believed that type 2 diabetes is a life sentence, stay with me until the very end. What you're about to learn could reshape how you see this condition and how you understand your own metabolism. Make sure to subscribe now and watch through to the final minutes, because we'll dive into real clinical evidence, long-term remission data, and critical safety insights that most people never hear about. So, what is type 2 diabetes? Really? If we focus only on the blood sugar number on a lab report, we miss the deeper biological story behind it. High glucose is not the first cause. It is the final visible consequence of a system that has been receiving the wrong signals for years. Let's start simple. The body uses glucose as fuel. But glucose cannot enter cells on its own. It needs insulin, a hormone produced by the pancreas. Imagine insulin as a key, and your cells as doors. When you eat, glucose enters the bloodstream. The pancreas releases insulin. Insulin unlocks the doors. Glucose moves into the cells to produce energy. Blood sugar returns to balance. The system runs smoothly, like a well-coordinated production line. In type 2 diabetes, however, the key is still there, often in higher amounts than normal, but the doors no longer respond properly. The cells become insulin resistant. They do not react efficiently to insulin's signal. Glucose struggles to enter. It remains in the bloodstream. That is why blood sugar levels rise. But stopping here only scratches the surface. The more important question is, why do cells become insulin resistant in the first place? Why would a system designed to function elegantly begin to resist its own hormone? The answer lies in energy storage. The body has multiple storage sites: glycogen in the liver, glycogen in muscle, and fat tissue. Under natural conditions, these storage spaces fill and empty in cycles of eating and fasting. But in the modern environment where food is constantly available, especially refined carbohydrates and sugar, these storage systems rarely empty. Imagine packing a suitcase. At first, everything fits neatly. But if you keep adding clothes without ever removing any, eventually the suitcase won't close. Cells behave similarly. When energy stores are full, they begin refusing additional glucose, not because they are malfunctioning at random, but because they have nowhere left to store it. In response, the body produces more insulin, trying harder to force glucose into already overfilled cells. But high insulin is like pushing harder on a suitcase that has already burst at the seams. Glucose remains in the blood. Insulin levels climb. The cycle of insulin resistance strengthens. And the story goes deeper. As excess energy continues to accumulate, fat begins appearing where it does not belong, particularly inside the liver and around the pancreas. This is where the real disruption begins. A fatty liver is not simply a storage issue. It alters how the liver functions. Normally, the liver carefully regulates glucose production and release. But when overloaded with fat, it becomes less responsive to insulin. It continues releasing glucose into the bloodstream even when the body does not need it. This explains why many people wake up with high fasting blood sugar despite not eating overnight. Meanwhile, the pancreas responsible for insulin production comes under increasing strain. Fat infiltration and chronic metabolic stress impair the beta cells. For years, these cells work overtime trying to compensate for insulin resistance. Over time, their efficiency declines, not necessarily because they are instantly destroyed, but because the metabolic environment surrounding them has become toxic and inflammatory. At this stage, the issue is no longer simply high blood sugar. Elevated glucose is merely the warning light on the dashboard. The deeper problem is that the body's energy storage system has exceeded its personal safe threshold. When the liver and pancreas are overwhelmed, glucose regulation begins to break down. So when we talk about type 2 diabetes, we are not just talking about sugar levels. We are describing a prolonged state of energy overflow, a system that has never been given the opportunity to empty its reserves. And from here, a new question naturally arises if the problem is chronic overload. What happens when we stop adding more and give the body time to clear, burn, and reset its energy stores? This is where the conversation about fasting truly begins. Once we understand that the root problem of type 2 diabetes is energy overload, fasting no longer appears extreme. It becomes biologically logical. When you stop adding more energy, the body doesn't shut down, it shifts gears. In the first few hours after your last meal, the body still has readily available fuel. Glucose circulates in the bloodstream, and insulin is present to manage it. This is the familiar fed state your body running on incoming energy. But when no new food arrives, a subtle shift begins. Insulin levels gradually decline. Insulin acts like a metabolic switch. When insulin is high, the body is in storage mode, prioritizing energy preservation. When insulin drops, the signal changes. The body recognizes that it's time to access stored reserves. This transition is quiet, but it is metabolically profound. After circulating, glucose is used. The body turns to glycogen stored in the liver. Glycogen is like short-term cash on hand, a quick-access energy reserve. During the first 8–12 hours, much of the body's fuel comes from this source. Throughout this period, insulin continues to fall. And this reduction in insulin is the key that unlocks fat burning, around the 1–2 hour mark. As glycogen stores begin to deplete, the body must seek an alternative fuel source. This is when the true metabolic shift occurs. Fat cells release fatty acids into the bloodstream. The liver takes these fatty acids and converts them into ketones, an efficient alternative fuel that both the brain and body can use. Ketone production is not abnormal or dangerous under normal physiological conditions. In fact, it reflects an ancient survival system. For most of human evolution, consistent access to food was not guaranteed. The ability to switch from burning glucose to burning fat was a survival advantage. Fasting does not invent a new mechanism, it simply activates one that has existed for thousands of years. In the context of type 2 diabetes, this metabolic shift carries special significance. As insulin declines and fat mobilization increases, the body is not just maintaining function, it is beginning to unload overfilled storage sites. The liver no longer processes a constant stream of incoming fuel. Instead, it begins using the fat that has accumulated within it. Fasting, then, is not about forcing the body into deprivation. It is about restoring hormonal balance. The system transitions from prolonged storage to active utilization, from overflow to release. And within that transition lies the biological foundation for improving insulin resistance. If we had to identify the central organ in type 2 diabetes, It would not be the bloodstream or the glucose reading on a monitor. It would be the liver. Fatty liver is at the core of this metabolic disorder. The liver is not just a storage site. It is a control center that regulates when and how much glucose enters the bloodstream. In a healthy state, the liver functions as a finely tuned regulator. After you eat, insulin rises and signals the liver, "Stop producing glucose. There's enough energy available." During fasting, when insulin drops, the liver releases a measured amount of glucose to maintain stable blood sugar. It is a beautifully balanced system. But when fat accumulates inside liver cells, that balance begins to break down. Excess fat reduces the liver's sensitivity to insulin. Even when insulin is present, the liver no longer responds properly to the signal to stop producing glucose. It continues releasing sugar into the bloodstream unnecessarily. This explains why many people with type 2 diabetes wake up with elevated fasting glucose despite not eating overnight. It's not simply about what they ate the day before. The liver is overproducing glucose without regulation. This is where fasting creates a profound shift. When you stop eating for an extended period, the liver no longer has to process a constant influx of new energy. No continuous glucose load. No repeated insulin spikes. Metabolic pressure begins to decrease. In a low insulin environment, the body must draw on stored energy, including fat accumulated in the liver. Clinical research has demonstrated a striking finding after just 7 days of controlled energy restriction. Liver fat can decrease by approximately 30%. This is not a minor adjustment, it is a foundational metabolic shift. As liver fat declines, insulin sensitivity improves. The liver begins responding appropriately to hormonal signals. It stops overproducing glucose. It releases sugar only when the body genuinely needs it. The first and most visible sign of this recovery is improved fasting blood sugar. The morning reading, once a source of anxiety, begins to stabilize. Not because medication was increased, but because the central regulatory organ has started functioning properly again. The key insight here is that fasting does not merely suppress symptoms. It addresses the underlying biological driver. When the liver is relieved of excess fat and metabolic overload, the entire glucose regulation system begins to rebalance. And that is why the liver stands at the center of the conversation about reversing type 2 diabetes. If the liver is the control center of glucose regulation, the pancreas is the conductor of insulin production. For years, we were taught that in type 2 diabetes, pancreatic beta cells, the cells responsible for producing insulin, gradually decline and die. This understanding made the disease appear as a one-way downward slope over time. Pancreatic function deteriorates and cannot recover. However, emerging research suggests a more nuanced reality. In many cases, beta cells are not completely destroyed. Instead, they have been chronically overworked. Imagine a factory forced to run at maximum capacity for years without rest. As fat accumulates around the pancreas, and insulin resistance compels it to secrete ever-increasing amounts of insulin, beta cells experience prolonged metabolic stress. Rather than immediately dying, some enter a state of reduced functionality, almost like a form of dormancy. Fat surrounding the pancreas plays a crucial role in this process. Excess visceral fat is not metabolically neutral. It creates a low-grade inflammatory environment that disrupts cellular signaling and places additional strain on beta cells. When the surrounding metabolic environment becomes hostile, these cells cannot function optimally. But this does not necessarily mean they are beyond recovery. Experimental research, including work from University of Southern California, has suggested that metabolic conditions resembling fasting characterized by reduced energy intake and lower insulin levels can activate cellular remodeling pathways. In controlled settings and animal models, such conditions have been associated with improved beta cell function and, in some contexts, regenerative responses. It is important to be precise here. This does not mean fasting magically creates a brand new pancreas. Science is more cautious than that. However, growing evidence indicates that when fat accumulation around the pancreas decreases and metabolic stress is relieved, a portion of insulin-producing capacity can recover. Previously suppressed beta cells may regain more effective function. This insight reshapes how we understand type 2 diabetes. If part of pancreatic dysfunction stems from an adverse metabolic environment rather than irreversible destruction, then the disease is not necessarily a strictly progressive, irreversible decline. Under the right conditions, particularly when liver and pancreatic fat are reduced, the endocrine system can regain meaningful balance. Therefore, when we speak about remission, we are not merely referring to temporarily lower blood sugar levels. We are discussing the possibility of functional recovery at the organ level, and the potential for the pancreas to wake up in a healthier metabolic environment is one of the reasons why reversing type 2 diabetes is no longer viewed as unrealistic as it once seemed. At this point, a reasonable question arises. Are these biological mechanisms supported by real-world clinical evidence? Or are they simply elegant theoretical models? Over the past decade, clinical research has worked to answer that question. One of the most influential studies in this field is the DIRECT trial conducted in the United Kingdom and published in 2017. Rather than intensifying medication, researchers implemented a structured low-calorie dietary program in its initial phase, followed by careful weight maintenance. Metabolically, this approach mimicked many of the effects associated with fasting: reduced insulin levels, decreased liver and pancreatic fat, and unloading of excess energy stores. After 1 year, the results were striking. 46% of participants achieved complete remission. Their blood glucose returned to normal levels, and they no longer required diabetes medication. This was not merely an improvement in numbers, it represented a shift in disease status. Even more compelling, 5-year follow-up data showed that participants who maintained their weight loss remained in remission. This reinforced the hypothesis that the key driver is not temporary glucose reduction, but sustained reduction of visceral fat and restoration of metabolic balance. More recent studies have expanded on these findings. A 2023 study reported that approximately 47% of participants achieved remission after 3 months of structured intermittent fasting. While the methodology differed from DIRECT, the common factor remained sufficient energy restriction to reduce liver fat and improve insulin sensitivity. In 2024, another study compared a 5 days eating, 2 days restricted intermittent fasting model with standard diabetes medication for blood glucose control. The results suggested that this fasting-based approach was comparable to medication in managing blood sugar levels among participants. Importantly, benefits extended beyond glucose numbers to broader metabolic markers. It is essential to interpret these results accurately. Remission does not mean permanent cure without ongoing effort. It means maintaining normal blood glucose without medication, provided that the lifestyle changes responsible for the improvement are sustained. If visceral fat returns, the metabolic dysfunction can reemerge. Nevertheless, type 2 diabetes is not always an irreversible, inevitably progressive condition. In a substantial proportion of individuals, reducing liver and pancreatic fat through energy restriction, including fasting-based strategies, can lead to meaningful remission. This is not magic. It is physiology applied with precision. One of the most important and often misunderstood concepts in type 2 diabetes is the idea of a personal fat threshold. If we focus solely on body weight or BMI, We fall into a common assumption: only people who are significantly overweight develop diabetes. And the heavier someone is, the worse the condition must be. But biology is more nuanced than that. Each person has a different capacity to store fat safely. Some individuals can accumulate a considerable amount of subcutaneous fat while their liver and pancreas continue functioning normally. Others may appear only mildly overweight or even relatively lean, yet have already exceeded their own safe storage limit. Once that personal threshold is crossed, fat begins accumulating in sensitive organs such as the liver and pancreas. That is when glucose regulation starts to deteriorate. This explains why two people with identical height and weight can have completely different metabolic outcomes. The difference lies not in the number on the scale, but in each body's unique ability to store fat without disrupting metabolic balance. When fat exceeds an individual's threshold, the liver becomes insulin resistant, the pancreas becomes overworked, and the pathological cascade begins. This concept carries an empowering message: not everyone needs to lose massive amounts of weight to improve or reverse the condition. For some individuals, losing just 10–15% of body weight may be sufficient to drop back below their personal fat threshold. When that happens, liver and pancreatic fat decline, insulin sensitivity improves, and blood glucose levels can return to normal. This reframes the goal. The objective is not to reach an arbitrary ideal weight on a chart, but to reduce visceral fat enough to relieve metabolic overload. It is about restoring biological balance, not punishing the body. Once internal fat drops below the disruptive threshold, the liver and pancreas regain the opportunity to function as designed. The concept of personal fat threshold reminds us that type 2 diabetes is not simply a story about obesity. It is a story about exceeding one's metabolic limits. And when we understand those limits, interventions become more precise, realistic, and compassionate. The story of fasting and diabetes did not begin in modern laboratories or online health trends. It began more than a century ago, at a time when medicine had far fewer treatment tools than today. Before insulin was discovered in 1922, physicians had limited options for controlling blood sugar. One of the pioneers in diabetes treatment was Elliot Joslin, an American physician who authored one of the first English-language textbooks on diabetes. In the absence of medication, his primary strategies were structured fasting and strict dietary control aimed at reducing energy intake. At the time, this approach was not fashionable, it was practical necessity. Clinical observations from Joslin's practice suggested that many patients experienced meaningful improvement when energy intake was significantly restricted and the body was given relief from constant metabolic demand. He reported reductions in blood glucose and improved survival compared to typical expectations of that era. While the methods were less refined and lacked our modern understanding of hormones, the core principle was clear: reducing metabolic overload could influence disease progression. Then came the landmark discovery of insulin. In 1922, a revolutionary breakthrough that saved countless lives, especially for individuals with type 1 diabetes. For type 2 diabetes, insulin and later glucose-lowering medications provided unprecedented control over blood sugar levels. Treatment focus gradually shifted toward pharmacological management of biochemical markers. The idea that the disease might be reversed through lifestyle and dietary intervention faded into the background. For decades, type 2 diabetes was widely viewed as a chronic, progressive condition managed by adding medications as needed. However, as global prevalence rose and the metabolic roots of the disease became clearer, researchers began revisiting fundamental questions. Are we primarily treating symptoms rather than underlying causes? Today, with deeper insight into insulin resistance, fatty liver, and personal fat thresholds, Science appears to be closing a historical loop, not by rejecting insulin or medication, but by integrating physiological understanding. If type 2 diabetes is driven by chronic energy overload, then reducing that overload may alter its course. What was once sidelined is now being re-examined under the lens of modern data. Medicine does not always move in a straight line forward. Sometimes it advances in spirals where earlier insights are rediscovered, refined, and validated through contemporary scientific evidence. Before discussing hope, we must discuss safety. Any metabolic strategy, no matter how promising, must be considered within the specific medical and physiological context of each individual. Fasting is not universally appropriate. First, fasting is not suitable for individuals with type 1 diabetes. This is a fundamentally different condition caused by autoimmune destruction of pancreatic beta cells. In these individuals, the body cannot produce sufficient insulin to sustain life. Fasting without close medical supervision may increase the risk of diabetic ketoacidosis, a serious and potentially life-threatening complication. Second, pregnant or breastfeeding women should not engage in restrictive fasting protocols. During these stages, the body requires stable nutritional intake to support fetal development and maternal health. Significant energy restriction should only be considered under medical guidance, if at all. Third, individuals with a history of eating disorders must approach fasting with extreme caution. Without proper structure and supervision, fasting may reactivate harmful psychological patterns related to food control and body image. Metabolic health cannot be separated from mental well-being. Another crucial group includes people who are currently using insulin or sulfonylurea medications. These medications increase insulin levels. If food intake is significantly reduced while medication doses remain unchanged, the risk of hypoglycemia rises. Symptoms such as shakiness, sweating, dizziness, rapid heartbeat, confusion, or fainting are warning signs. These are not positive indicators that fasting is working, they are signals requiring medical attention. The core principle is clear. Always work with a healthcare professional if you have underlying medical conditions and are considering fasting. Medication adjustments, glucose monitoring, and progress evaluation should be handled systematically. Fasting can be a powerful tool, but only when used responsibly and within a safe medical framework. Hope is real, but sustainable hope must always be paired with caution and clinical responsibility. We've just walked through an important journey, from understanding that type 2 diabetes is not merely high blood sugar, but a state of chronic energy overload in the liver and pancreas, from insulin resistance and fatty liver to pancreatic stress, and how fasting may lower insulin, mobilize visceral fat, and create the biological conditions for recovery. The key takeaway is this: in many cases, type 2 diabetes is not necessarily an irreversible life sentence. For a significant proportion of individuals, when liver and pancreatic fat drop below their personal threshold, glucose regulation can return to normal. Not because of magic, but because physiology is restored to balance. That said, hope must be paired with responsibility. Fasting is not appropriate for everyone. No one should stop medication or alter treatment plans without medical supervision. The goal is not to fight your body, but to work with it, understanding hormonal signals, metabolic limits, and how to create conditions that allow repair. If there is one core message from today's discussion, it is this: your body is not broken. It is responding to the energy environment it has been placed in. When that environment changes, biology can change too. If you found this valuable, consider subscribing and staying with us for future videos. We'll continue breaking down human metabolism with clear science, logical physiology, and practical insight. Because when you understand the mechanism, fear turns into strategy. And strategy is always more powerful than despair.